Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We will begin with chapter 25, verse 18. Actually, we'll begin with chapter 25, verse 17. So Hashem says to Moshe, Sorores HaMidyanim, lay siege around the Midianites, V'hikisem osam, lay siege around the Midianites and strike them. This is, just to give you context, this is after the story of Pinchas acting in a zealous manner. This is after that story has transpired. After that, God gives Moshe the instructions that the Jewish people should wage war against the Midianites. Verse 18, Kitzorim heim lochem, because they have caused you great distress, b'nichleihem asher niklu lachem al dvar pa'or, in the matters that they sullied you regarding Pa'or. Pa'or was an avodah zarah, was an idol that was frequently worshipped, deity that was frequently worshipped. The Aldvar Kozbi Vasnisi Midyana Chosam Hamukavi Omamagifal Dvar Pa'or. And the other way that the Midianites have sullied you has to do with the story of Kozbi. Kozbi was the daughter of a Midianite prince. She was the one who was publicly having relations with the leader of the Jewish people. She was the woman in the relationship that Pinchas killed the two of them. So God says it's time to fight a war against the Midianites because of what they did to you in terms of avodah zarah, and because of that whole story with Kozbi, that woman who was publicly having relations with a Jewish leader. Okay, let's see the Ramban to try to get a little bit of a handle on this story. Ramban on Pasuk Yurches. V'tam b'nichleihem. Kasher pirashti, as I've explained, ki ziknei Midyan chashvu hamachshava hazos hara. This whole plan, just in case people aren't aware, this is such a fascinating parsha last week, and the story of Pinchas happens right at the end of the parsha. I think a lot of people lose focus of it. So at the very end of the parsha, Rashi brings down the medrash that basically everything flopped with getting Bilam. So Bilam said, I got a new idea for you guys. Their God really hates it when they're involved with avodah zarah, when they're involved with sexual immorality. So why don't you send your beautiful women and try to seduce their men into relations at avodah zarah? So the Ramban is going along the lines of that. Ramban says that the leaders of Midian cooked up this whole plan. K'moshe Omar vayomer Moav el ziknei Midian. Like it says in the pasuk that Moav, at the end of last parsha, it says, the beginning of last week's parsha, Moav spoke to the elders of Midian. Kivohem nisyatsu mitchila. The whole planning stage of everything involving Bilam, the cursing and all of that, and says the Ramban, the end of Parshas Balak was a process between the elders of Midian and leaders of Moav. V'heim nasnu eitzazu l'Moav, shetiznena b'nosam imohem, v'yatzmidu osam leval pa'or, la'adicha me'al Hashem. So the elders of Midian gave this idea to Moav that the women of Moav should be sent to seduce the Jewish men, have relations with them, and move them away from the service of God. Okay. The Imlo Nizkar, even though it's not at all explicit, at the end of Parshas Balak, it's the beginning of chapter 25. If anyone wants to look, it says in the Parsha that Yisrael were living in Shittim, and the men of Yisrael began to get involved with the daughters of Moav. And then, two psukim later, it says that the Jewish people began to get involved with Baal Pa'or, which was avodah zarah, and that sets the stage for this big showdown with Pinchas and a very public thing. Now, the woman who was involved with the sexual relations public was a woman from Midian. But the stories about Baal Pa'or and the women, those were all from Moav. So the Ramban is very bothered. What do you want with Midian? You're upset about that whole avodah zarah story? Talk to Moav about that. Midian didn't do that. Midian did one thing in the psukim. There was one woman from Midian who publicly had relations with one prominent Jewish male. You got to wage a war over that? But the Ramban says, no, this is part of a much bigger plan. And Moav and Midian were in cahoots from the beginning of last week's parsha. So this story at the end of last week's parsha is an extension of that plan. That's one thing, says the Ramban. V'od sheshochu lahem bas malkam lisno simoyim. It's not a small thing that a daughter of a prominent leader of Midian went to have relations with a Jewish leader. That's not nothing. There's a plan here. That's what's meant in the pasuk that we started with this morning, the matter regarding Cosby, the daughter of the prince of Midian, their sister. Ramban says, what do you think? You think there's this prominent woman among their nation who just happened to be wandering around near the Jewish encampment? You think it just happened that way? Of course it didn't happen that way. This was a plan, and this was a plan from the highest levels of the nation. She was an exceptionally beautiful woman. And the elders of Midian sent her on this mission. Okay. So that's how the Ramban explains the finger of blame on Midian, that if Cosby was involved, it must have been a high-level plan. And even though a lot of the things that happened were from Moab and not from Midian, it was because Midian was telling Moab what to do. The Karavhu Shayagam Bilam Ba'etzasu. The Ramban says it makes a lot of sense to say that Bilam was involved in this also. Bilam, of course, the cursor, the prophet, whatever exactly you use for his description in last week's parsha. Ki b'shuvo me'eretz Moab avar b'Midian. When he was finished on his fabulous failure in the land of Moab, he passed through Midian. Ki darko misham, because that's where he came from in the first place. V'haya b'yotzei malchus. He was from the royal advisors in Midian. V'ulai nisakev sham ladas ma yeyosavayim. Maybe he even hung around to see what would happen. Lefichach mitzau Yisrael b'Midian v'haraguhu sham. Actually, it's later in this book. It's not in this week's parsha, but it's down the road. The Jewish people killed Bilam in war with Midian. The Jewish people killed Bilam in their war with Midian. So the Ramban says it makes sense because he was a prominent person in Midian. He was passing through. He went on his way back home and he stopped off Midian, and that was a mistake because he hung around for all that. They call him another very interesting point. So it makes a point in the Torah of saying that the Jewish people killed Bilam. Why did the Jewish people kill Bilam? Presumably he was on their list of people that would be correct to kill. Presumably he wasn't just in the middle of the fight, manning the cannons. Presumably not. So what did the Jewish people have against Bilam? It's hard to say that we knew that this story was going on in last week's parsha. It's hard to say that. I mean, the whole thing is just being said from the perspective of the narrator. So the Ramban suggests that when we say strike the Midianites in this pasuk we're reading, because they've had these plans, Ramban says it's plausible to say that it got back to the Jews that Bilam had these plans. And by the way, even if they didn't know what he was doing, I mean, he didn't end up doing anything of consequence to them. It wasn't like they have to kill him to protect their lives. I mean, God clearly is not, moved by the curses of Bilam. So what are they killing him for? You don't just kill people just to kill them. So the Ramban says this pasuk is licensed to kill Bilam. If you know that Bilam, if you assume that Bilam is involved with the plot, this pasuk is licensed because this is the whole thing. They've plotted against you. Bilam is one of the plotters. Now, the obvious question that comes up when you're looking at this Ramban is, I understand why a finger of blame is being pointed at Midian. Let's get Midian. Those guys are no good. Fine. Why are we not pointing a finger of blame at Moab? We saw the psukim. This whole thing of the women going to seduce Jewish men were Moabite women. Why aren't we waging a war against Moab? I get why we're waging a war against Midian, but let's get Moab too. So for that, we have the famous pasuk that God says to the Jewish people, al totzar es Moav. Don't cause affliction to Moab. Don't cause distress to Moab. So even though Moab did this very inappropriate thing to the Jewish people, they're not supposed to touch them. So Midian was involved, get Midian, but leave Moab alone. Yisrael batchilo bao b'gvul Edom, v'zeiram aleim v'nishmartem mi'od. When the Jewish people were first moving through, they passed by the boundary of Edom, and God said, caution yourselves. They came to Moab area, and God says, don't afflict the people of Moab. And then it says, don't cause problems to Moab nor to Ammon. Okay. Okay. I now, by the way, just to remind everybody, we have a unique relationship with Moab because Moab is our cousins. Moab and Ammon are the descendants of Lot. You know that whole story with Lot, that his two daughters, they became impregnated from him. That's Moab and Ammon. So Moab, we lay off of. Okay, we've spent a lot of time on this, Ramban. I want to move on to the next point. Let's go on to chapter 26, verse 2. Yeah, let's start with verse 1. Chapter 26, verse 1. And it was after the plague. God said to Moshe, God said to Moshe and Elazar, by the way, just a note, Aaron's not in the picture anymore. Aaron passed away. I think Aaron passed away while I was on vacation, but if I'm not mistaken. But Aaron is no longer the Kohen Gadol. Elazar is the Kohen Gadol. So God tells Moshe and Elazar, verse 2, count the heads of the Jewish people from the age of 20 and up, all those who will go out to war among the Jewish people. Yet another counting of the Jewish people. Why are the Jewish people being counted over here? We will discuss this tomorrow, God willing. But what we really discuss today is an understanding, why is the war against Midian? What did Midian do exactly? And to whatever extent the war is against Midian, why isn't it also against Moab? And that we were discussing with the Ramban.